There was a time when the United States was nothing more than a scattered group of weak colonies, controlled by a distant empire, struggling to survive on unfamiliar land, divided by fear, uncertainty, and limited resources. No one, not even the most powerful leaders of that era, could have imagined that this fragile beginning would one day transform into the most dominant force on the planet. But something changed. Something powerful, something strategic, something almost unstoppable. This is not just a story of growth, this is a story of ambition, war, influence, and calculated decisions that reshaped the entire world. Because the rise of the United States was not an accident. It was built, step by step, through moments of chaos, conflict, and opportunity. Imagine a nation born out of rebellion, where ordinary people stood against one of the greatest empires in history, the British Empire, and somehow won. That victory alone shocked the world. But it was only the beginning. What followed was a series of bold expansions, strategic land acquisitions, and relentless ambition that pushed this young nation far beyond its original limits. The United States didn't just grow, it absorbed, expanded, and adapted, turning weakness into strength and isolation into influence. Every decision, every conflict, every alliance was another step towards something bigger. Something global. But here's the part most people don't talk about. Power is never built in peace alone. Behind the rise of America lies a long history of wars, both visible and hidden. From early battles on its own soil to global conflicts like World War I and World War II, the United States positioned itself not just as a participant, but as a decisive force. And after the world was left shattered, America didn't just rebuild, it took the lead. Economically, militarily, politically, it stepped into a role no other country could fully match. Then came a different kind of war. Not fought entirely with guns, but with ideology, intelligence, and global influence. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union created a new battlefield, one that spread across continents, shaping governments, economies, and entire societies. This was the era where America refined its power, learning how to control outcomes without always firing a single shot. Through alliances, economic systems, and strategic interventions, the United States expanded its reach in ways the world had never seen before. And yet, with all this power, questions remain. Was this rise inevitable or carefully engineered? Did America become a superpower through strength alone, or through decisions made in the shadows? Because the deeper you look into this history, the more complex it becomes. Success, dominance, influence, they all come with a cost. And that cost is written across decades of global events, decisions, and consequences that still shape the world today. This is the story of how a struggling group of colonies became the most powerful country on Earth. A story of vision, conflict, strategy, and control. A story filled with moments that changed the course of history forever. And as we go deeper into this journey, you'll begin to see that the rise of the United States is not just about the past. It's about understanding the world we live in right now. Long before the United States became a global superpower, it was a fragile experiment. 13 separate colonies stretched along the eastern edge of North America, each with its own identity, its own struggles, and its own fears. These colonies were under the control of the British Empire, one of the most powerful forces in the world at the time. For years, the relationship between the colonies and Britain was relatively stable. But everything began to change after a series of costly wars left Britain deep in debt. To recover financially, the empire turned to its colonies, imposing heavy taxes and strict laws. For the people living there, this was more than just an economic burden. It was a question of control, freedom, and identity. Tension slowly turned into anger, and anger turned into resistance. The colonists began to push back, refusing to accept a system where they had no voice in decisions that directly affected their lives. Events like protests, boycotts, and clashes became more frequent, building up to a breaking point. Then came a moment that would echo through history: the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War. What started as a rebellion quickly became a full-scale war, one that many believed the colonies could never win. After all, they were facing a global empire with superior resources, a trained military, and vast experience in warfare. But the colonists had something different. They had determination, local knowledge, and a growing sense of unity. Leaders began to emerge, individuals who believed that independence was not just a dream, but a possibility. With support from unexpected allies, including France, the colonies managed to turn the tide of the war. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but eventually, against all odds, the colonies achieved something extraordinary. They didn't just resist. They won, and in doing so, they gave birth to a new nation, the United States of America. However, independence did not mean stability. The newly formed country faced enormous challenges. It had to create a government from scratch, build an economy, and maintain unity among states that often disagreed with each other. The early years were filled with uncertainty, debates, and difficult decisions. But slowly, the foundation began to take shape. A system of governance was established, one that aimed to balance power and prevent the rise of tyranny. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to hold the nation together. Then came the next phase of growth, expansion. The United States was no longer content with its original borders. It began to look westward, driven by a belief that its future lay in expansion across the continent. Through a combination of negotiation, purchase, and conflict, the country rapidly increased its size. Land deals like the Louisiana Purchase doubled its territory almost overnight, while other areas were gained through wars and treaties. This expansion brought opportunity, but it also brought conflict, especially with Native American tribes and neighboring nations. As the country grew, so did its ambition. The United States was no longer just trying to survive. It was beginning to define its place in the world. Trade increased, industries started to develop, and the population continued to rise. But beneath this growth, there were deep divisions, particularly over issues like slavery and state power. These tensions would eventually explode into one of the most defining conflicts in American history, the American Civil War. This war was not about expansion or independence. It was about the soul of the nation itself. It tested the strength of the United States like never before. And although the country would emerge from it stronger and more unified, the scars it left behind would shape its future for generations. By the end of this period, the United States had transformed from a fragile collection of colonies into a growing, ambitious nation with the potential to become something far greater. But this was still only the beginning. The real transformation, the rise to global power, was yet to come. By the late 19th century, the United States was no longer a fragile nation struggling to survive. It had become a rapidly growing power, fueled by industry, innovation, and an unrelenting drive to expand its influence. Cities were rising, railroads were stretching across the continent, and factories were producing goods at a scale the world had never seen before. This was the era of transformation, where America shifted from a nation focused on internal growth to one that began looking outward, beyond its borders, toward global influence. Wealth was increasing, technology was advancing, and with it came a new kind of confidence, one that would soon push the United States onto the world stage. But power on a global scale is never achieved without conflict. As European empires dominated vast regions of the world, the United States began to realize that if it wanted to compete, it needed to act. This realization led to one of the first major steps toward becoming an international power, the Spanish-American War. What began as a conflict over Cuba quickly turned into something much larger. In a surprisingly short period of time, the United States defeated Spain, a once dominant empire, and gained control of key territories, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This victory marked a turning point. America was no longer just a nation. It was becoming an empire with overseas influence. With new territories came new responsibilities and new challenges. The United States now had to manage lands far from its mainland, dealing with different cultures, political systems, and resistance movements. This period tested America's ability to project power across oceans, and it forced the country to develop stronger military capabilities and more complex strategies. At the same time, its economy continued to grow, becoming one of the largest in the world. Industrial production surged, and American businesses began to expand internationally, spreading influence not just through military means, but through trade and finance. Then came a moment that would change everything: the outbreak of World War I. At first, the United States remained on the sidelines, watching as Europe descended into chaos. But as the war dragged on, and global stability began to crumble, America made a critical decision to enter the conflict. When it did, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Fresh American troops, resources, and industrial strength helped tip the scales, leading to the eventual defeat of the Central Powers. When the war ended, the United States emerged not just as a victor, but as a key player in shaping the future of the world. However, the period that followed was not as stable as it seemed. While America experienced economic growth during the 1920s, cracks were beginning to form beneath the surface. These cracks would soon turn into a full-scale collapse: the Great Depression. It was one of the darkest economic periods in history, affecting millions of people and shaking confidence in the global financial system. For a moment, it seemed like America's rise might come to a halt. But instead of collapsing completely, the country adapted, restructured, and slowly began to recover. Then, just as the world was trying to rebuild, another global conflict erupted: World War II. This war would prove to be even more devastating than the first, involving nations from every corner of the globe. Once again, the United States initially stayed out of direct involvement, but everything changed after a sudden and devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. In that moment, the United States was pulled fully into the war, and what followed was one of the most significant military mobilizations in history. American factories shifted to wartime production, creating weapons, vehicles, and supplies on an unimaginable scale. Millions of soldiers were deployed across multiple fronts, fighting in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. The United States was not just participating, it was leading. Its economic strength, combined with its military capabilities, played a decisive role in bringing the war to an end. And when victory finally came, the world looked very different. Europe was in ruins, many empires had fallen, and power structures had been completely reshaped. In the middle of all this, one nation stood stronger than ever: the United States. It had not only survived the chaos, it had risen above it. Economically, it was unmatched. Militarily, it was dominant. Politically, it had influence across the globe. This was the moment when the United States truly stepped into its role as a global superpower. But with great power comes new challenges. The end of World War II did not bring lasting peace. It marked the beginning of a new kind of conflict, one that would not always be fought with direct battles, but with strategy, influence, and control. The stage was set for a rivalry that would define the next era of global history. As the dust of World War II began to settle, the world did not enter an age of peace. It entered an age of tension, fear, and silent conflict. Two superpowers emerged from the chaos, each representing a completely different vision for the future of the world. On one side stood the United States, a nation driven by capitalism, democracy, and global expansion. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, a powerful force built on communism, centralized control, and ideological influence. This was not just a political rivalry, it was a battle of ideas, a struggle to shape the direction of humanity itself. And so began the Cold War. Unlike the wars that came before, this conflict was rarely fought through direct confrontation between the two superpowers. Instead, it spread across continents, turning smaller nations into battlegrounds where influence, power, and control were constantly being contested. The United States quickly realized that maintaining its position as a global leader required more than just military strength. It required alliances, economic dominance, and strategic positioning. This led to the formation of powerful networks like NATO, which connected multiple countries under a shared defense systems, strengthening America's global reach. But the Cold War was not fought only through diplomacy and alliances. It was also fought through fear, especially the fear of nuclear destruction. Both the United States and the Soviet Union rapidly expanded their nuclear arsenals, creating a situation where one wrong move could lead to global catastrophe. This delicate balance of power became known as mutually assured destruction, a concept that kept both sides in check, but also kept the entire world on edge. Every decision, every action, every move carried the weight of potential disaster. Despite avoiding direct war, the United States was deeply involved in multiple conflicts during this period. One of the most significant was the Korean War, where the United States, along with its allies, fought to prevent the spread of communism in the Korean Peninsula. This was followed by the Vietnam War, a long and complex conflict that tested America's military strength and its political resolve. Unlike previous wars, Vietnam did not end in a clear victory, and it raised serious questions within the United States about the limits of its power and the consequences of its actions. At the same time, the Cold War extended beyond the battlefield into areas like space, technology, and intelligence. The race to reach space became a symbol of dominance, with both superpowers competing to prove their superiority. The United States invested heavily in science and innovation, eventually achieving a historic milestone by landing astronauts on the moon. This was more than just a scientific achievement. It was a statement to the world about American capability, ambition, and technological leadership. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, intelligence agencies played a critical role in shaping global events. Operations were carried out in secrecy, governments were influenced, and alliances were formed or broken based on strategic interests. The United States learned how to project power not just through visible force, but through hidden actions. Decisions made in silence that would impact entire nations. This was a new kind of influence, one that did not always appear on the surface, but was deeply embedded in global politics. As decades passed, the pressure between the two superpowers continued to build. Economic strain, political instability, and internal challenges began to weaken the Soviet Union. And then, almost unexpectedly, the balance of power shifted. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, bringing an end to the Cold War. The rivalry that had defined global politics for nearly half a century was suddenly over. When the dust settled, only one superpower remained standing: the United States. It had outlasted its greatest rival, expanded its influence across the globe, and established itself as the dominant force in international affairs. But victory did not mean the end of challenges. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new era, one where the United States would face a different kind of world, with new threats, new conflicts, and new questions about the limits of its power. The age of one superpower had begun, but the story was far from over. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world entered a completely new phase, one where the United States stood alone as the dominant global superpower. For the first time in modern history, there was no equal rival to challenge its authority on a global scale. This moment, often described as a unipolar world, gave America unprecedented influence over international politics, economics, and military affairs. But with this dominance came a new kind of responsibility, and a new set of conflicts that would redefine the nature of power in the 21st century. The early 1990s quickly proved that peace was not guaranteed. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States led a massive international coalition in response, launching the Gulf War. This war was swift, decisive, and highly strategic, showcasing America's advanced military technology and its ability to coordinate global alliances. The victory reinforced the image of the United States as the world's leading military power, capable of projecting force anywhere, at any time. But it also signaled something deeper: that America was willing to act as a global enforcer when its interests or the stability of the international system were at risk. As the years passed, conflicts became more complex. The threats were no longer just powerful nations, but also non-state actors, extremist groups, and unstable regions. Then came a moment that would change everything: the attacks of September 11, 2001. In a single day, the sense of security within the United States was shattered. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost, and the impact was felt across the entire world. It was not just an attack, it was a turning point that reshaped global politics, security policies, and military strategies. In response, the United States launched the war in Afghanistan, targeting the Taliban regime that had provided shelter to those responsible for the attacks. What began as a mission to dismantle terrorist networks quickly evolved into a long and complicated war, lasting nearly 2 decades. It became the longest war in American history, highlighting both the strength and the limitations of military power in dealing with unconventional threats. Just 2 years later, another major conflict began. The Iraq War. This war was justified by claims of weapons of mass destruction and the need to remove a dangerous regime. However, as time passed, the situation became increasingly complex. The initial military victory was followed by years of instability, insurgency, and political challenges. The consequences of this war extended far beyond Iraq, influencing the entire Middle East, and raising global debates about the role of the United States in international conflicts. During this period, the nature of warfare itself began to change. Traditional large-scale battles were replaced by counterinsurgency operations, intelligence-driven missions, and advanced technologies like drones. The United States adapted quickly, developing new strategies to deal with emerging threats. It expanded its global military presence, established bases in strategic locations, and strengthened alliances to maintain its influence. At the same time, America's power was not limited to the battlefield. Economically, it remained a central force in the global system, with the US dollar continuing to dominate international trade. Politically, it played a key role in shaping international organizations and agreements. Culturally, its influence spread through media, technology, and innovation, reaching almost every corner of the world. This combination of military, economic, and cultural power created a level of influence that few nations in history had ever achieved. But with this level of dominance came increasing scrutiny and criticism. Questions began to emerge about the cost of these wars, the impact on global stability, and the long-term consequences of intervention. Some argued that the United States was maintaining order, while others believed it was creating new conflicts. These debates reflected a deeper reality, that power, no matter how great, is always accompanied by challenges and consequences. As the 21st century continued, new global players began to rise, new technologies began to reshape the world, and new forms of conflict began to emerge. The United States was still powerful, still influential, but the world around it was changing rapidly. The question was no longer just how America became a superpower, but whether it could maintain that position in an increasingly complex and competitive world. The story of America's rise had reached its peak, but the future remained uncertain. At this point in history, the United States stands at a crossroads. Still powerful, still influential, but no longer unchallenged. The journey from a group of fragile colonies to the most dominant nation on Earth is nothing short of extraordinary. But the story does not end with power. It evolves, it shifts, and it faces new tests that are unlike anything in the past. Because in today's world, power is no longer defined by military strength alone. It is shaped by technology, economics, global alliances, and the ability to adapt to a rapidly changing reality. For decades, the United States built its dominance through a combination of strategic decisions, global conflicts, and economic expansion. It outlasted rivals like the Soviet Union, led the world through moments of crisis, and established systems that continue to influence global order. But now, new powers are rising. Countries like China are expanding their economic reach, investing in technology, and challenging the balance of power in ways that were once unimaginable. The global stage is becoming more competitive, more complex, and more unpredictable. At the same time, the nature of conflict itself is evolving. Wars are no longer fought only on battlefields. They are fought in cyberspace, through information, through economic pressure, and through influence over global systems. The United States is adapting to these changes, investing in innovation, strengthening its alliances, and redefining its strategies. But the challenges are real. Internal divisions, economic pressures, and global competition all play a role in shaping the future of American power. And yet, despite these challenges, one thing remains clear. The United States is still one of the most influential forces in the world. Its culture, its technology, its economy, and its military continue to impact millions of lives across the globe. From the decisions made in Washington to the innovations developed in Silicon Valley, the reach of America extends far beyond its borders. This influence is not just about control. It is about presence, about shaping the direction of the modern world. But history has shown us something important. No power remains unchallenged forever. Every empire, every superpower, eventually faces moments of transformation. The question is not whether the United States will change, it is how it will change, and what that change will look like. Will it adapt and remain a leading force, or will new powers reshape the global order? When we look back at the entire journey, from the American Revolutionary War to global conflicts like World War II, from the tensions of the Cold War to the modern challenges of the 21st century, we begin to see a pattern. The rise of the United States was never simple. It was built through struggle, through decisions, through moments of risk and opportunity. It was shaped by leaders, by citizens, and by events that changed the course of history. And now, as we stand in the present, that story continues. The future of the United States is not yet written. It will be shaped by the choices made today, by the challenges faced tomorrow, and by the ability to navigate a world that is more connected and more divided than ever before. This is not just the story of a nation. It is the story of power, of ambition, of influence, and of the constant struggle to maintain it. Because the rise of the United States was never just about becoming the strongest country in the world. It was about what happens after you reach the top.